It's the way I can think of it. I'm opening the door.
Opening the door. Welcome.
And now you're moving more. So I don't know if what's changed, but
My wife probably kicked all the kids off the internet. Is probably what happened.
you got 3?
I have 3. Yeah, we have 3. And she's graciously herding them upstairs because she's usually in the room behind me is where she set up her work from home office, and
Okay.
she's down there all day, and I'm upstairs
Right.
with the kids doing the homeschooling and everything.
Well, I appreciate this, and I'm sure
yeah.
everyone that I'm now going to open the door to will as well.
Okay.
So here we go.
Thank you.
Hello, come on in, everybody. Come on
Hello.
in. Welcome. So everybody should be fine, and you're still unmuted, Andrew. So
Yep.
I will start my preamble because it is officially, oh, it's almost 2:30. I think I'm
Perfect.
early. Here we go. All right. Hey, there's Laura. Welcome to the 5th annual book talk celebrating Earth Day through the lens of literature, fundraising for the Canadian Ecology Education Foundation. And I'm going to do this fancy thing here and share a beautiful picture of the Mattawa River where we would love to be, but instead we'll just channel ourselves into the channel. And so during the presentation, everyone will be muted except myself and Andrew. And during the Q&A, I will unmute you. If you want to raise your digital hand, I will unmute you and you can share your question. Or if you don't feel comfortable with that or can't find it, and I've got instructions in the chat box, then you can just share your questions on chat and I'll be the moderator for Andrew. Please be advised that this is being recorded for posterity's sake, and I hope to upload it with a transcript in a couple of weeks. We'll see how I do with that. So along with a couple of the Zoom instructions in the chat, I've also included information on Andrew Forbes, his book, and how to donate to the Canadian Ecology Centre Education Foundation, because this is a fundraiser and it will be fun raising funds. Yes. Oh, and now I mean, you know what I've done? This is number 4 of today, and I'm still like, this is I push here. So thank you. This is all working. I wish to share with you, and this is this land acknowledgement. We are so thankful on Earth Day to be associated with Indigenous peoples and the history of the river, which does include the exploration of Canada and the fur trade. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples connected to and on this land. We are grateful for the opportunity to work within the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. The land on which peoples gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and specifically the Nipissing First Nation. MATTAWA River Writers Festival commit ourselves to the work of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. See, sometimes my driving is a little bumpy. Sorry, everybody. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andrew Forbes. Andrew was born in Ottawa, Ontario, and has spent much, or did spend much of your childhood in Atlantic Canada, and currently resides in Peterborough, Ontario, where if we hear any sounds from above, that's where the 3 kids and his wife are having some great big party. So that's what the extra sound effects will be. Andrew's latest collection of short stories is called Lands and Forests. How appropriate for our festival. It's set primarily in Ontario. It surveys the emotional landscapes of people whose lives, though rooted deeply in the land and their small communities, are still rocked by the ripples of great cultural change. Wow, kind of like today is in the last 4 weeks, huh? So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about where this book came from and your stories and your writing process and how nature influences it. I'm going to now do a ability for Andrew to share his screen. It's the first time today, and everybody is a part of this. Wonderful. Multiple participants share simultaneously. So now you're going to be able to do that when you want to, I hope is going to work.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right, so that was fingers crossed.
It won't. Okay. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Happy Earth Day. This is a very interesting way to be spending Earth Day. This is a strange way to be doing things. I was really looking forward to going to the Canadian Ecology Centre and to meeting people face to face and to being by the river and sharing the campfires that I've heard so much about. But we're making do, which is kind of the theme of life right now. We're all making do. So this is the next best thing, and I think it's going to be fun. I hope we'll have a good discussion today. I'm sure we will. I want to say thank you to Janet Joy and to Bill and to everyone at the Canadian Ecology Centre for putting this together. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in remotely today to listen. My name is for a few minutes. Something I've prepared. I'm going to read awkwardly from some notes on my phone over here in my hand. Then I'm going to read from my book. And then I hope we can open it up and people may have comments or questions. And I'd love to hear what people had to say or answer anything, hopefully, that I can. So let me share this. I'll start by sharing this and give you something other than you to look at. Tell me if this works. Tell me if this doesn't work. Everyone see that? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Okay, the question that was posed: has nature influenced writing? And the answer that I have is twofold, because I can't write anything simply. The first answer is this: there's restorative, palliate to the affliction of contemporary life. I'm happiest and most productive when I'm in the proximity of nature, and spending time in it recharges me. It lowers my anxiety, which can be rampant otherwise. It clears my head, it silences those voices, and it lessens the aches. It does this by connecting me to something longer lived. It exposes me to a leaner truth, which dwarfs nearly all my insignificant concerns. I am reassured by the awareness that there are things which existed before me and which will outlive me. The cycles which govern the natural world indict my devotion to temporary and trivial systems.
Well, hello. I believe Andrew had, oh, no, there you are. Why did you get kicked off? Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
You kind
I
of,
still see boxes for everyone.
okay. That was strange. Because your
Do you hear
screen,
me?
yeah,
Everyone's still there.
okay.
Okay, my screen is not shared. Is that right?
It's still
See,
on,
we're all learning.
yeah, exactly. No, we're still sharing mode. Because I didn't,
Okay, you can see the picture there of the big forest.
not anymore. We're back to you. Your screen
Oh,
stopped.
okay, just a second here. All right, well, we'll try it again. Everything seems to be working here. How's that? You see it again?
Yes. Okay, we're
Okay.
in the forest. It looks like National Geographic has landed on your house.
Perfect. Okay, I will continue then, and we'll get to that picture in just one second. Something pummels us, something barely sheathed, writes Annie Dillard in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Power broods and lights, we're played on like a pipe. Our breath is not our own. The precise mechanism, I think, is this. Upon immersion, nature introduces wonder into the brain and bloodstream, a compound otherwise sorely lacking in our lives, and one which acts as an antibody against fatigue, cynicism, and despair. There are so few things which can truly overwhelm us, can awe us, that to be confronted by something which contains that power is necessarily tonic. Without this medicine, I don't believe it would be possible for me to do what I do. Okay, so if the technology is still working and you're looking at a photograph now, that yellow box there is the house I grew up in, and this is the unexceptional suburban neighborhood where I spent most of my childhood. It's in the east end of Ottawa. I turned 8 years old the week we moved in. The road was freshly paved, our driveway wasn't yet, and our lawn arrived about a week later on the back of a truck. But the great thing about it was that broad green expanse you see, which takes up about 80% of the picture. That's a wooded ravine protected by the Ottawa Greenbelt Plan. It's a second growth stand of mostly maple and birch and beech. There are a few clumps of coniferous trees in there. At the bottom of it all wends a small clear stream that would freeze over in the winter and would be beautiful and mucky in the summer. It was in there that I was first introduced to that green foliate light and that scent of loamy leaf rot. I spent all kinds of time in there, alone or with my friends who lived right across the street there. We would build forts, we would forge trails, we would catch frogs. I would go mountain biking in there. I broke my kneecap in there.
Mm.
My parents still live in that house that I've awkwardly encircled there and squared there. And when I go back, I always make a point of going for a walk in the woods or snowshoeing in the winter. I bring the kids in there and we go tobogganing as well. I know now just how small it actually is, but as a child, it seemed to me like it stretched to the ends of the earth. And I can still tell you exactly how far you have to go into it to get away from the sounds that surround it, to get away from the noise of traffic or lawnmowers or snowblowers. Then I grew up, or I got older anyway. That's probably safer to say. And I did the smartest and luckiest thing that I have ever done, in that I was able to convince the woman who would later marry me that I was worth a shot. And it turns out that her family, that was lucky in a lot of ways, but it turns out that one of the ways was that her family had this beautiful place here that you're looking at on an island in the Rideau Canal system, about 35 minutes or so north of Kingston. I'll bring my text back up here. She spent her childhood summers there and occasional winters. My in-laws still tell the story about the one winter they drove the car across the ice and how they would never, ever, ever do that again. Everyone survived, but it was harrowing from the sounds of it. But it's a beautiful island and there were no cars on it. The only way to get to it was by boat, and there were no roads, just these beautiful trails through the woods cut by the old farmer's tractor. At the far end of the island, the south end of the island, there was a giant boulder called the Cathedral. I wish I had a photo of it, but I spent a couple days looking for it and I couldn't, unfortunately. That place pretty much became my favorite place on earth very quickly, and I would get a lot of work done there. Within a few years, though, Christy and I and our daughter at the time, now we have 3, but we didn't then, move to Peterborough from Eastern Ontario. Shortly after that, Christy's parents sold that place, and that was very difficult to let go of. I think more for me than it was for them, which is funny. They tend to be less sentimental than I am. But then we came to this place, which is a beautiful spot, about 35 minutes north of Peterborough. And after a few summers, we built this, which is a very nice place to spend time.
Wow.
And it gives us access to this, which is the lake in front and all the trails and roads nearby. That is my son, the taller of the 2, and my niece on the left. We built a treehouse for the kids. That's the view at the treehouse window. I think that's the Wolf Moon from a few Januaries ago, rising over that spot. This now has become, as I'm sure you can imagine, just about my favorite place on earth. And it's been a very productive spot for me. And it's also where a lot of Lands and Forests was written. And the landscapes immediately surrounding this area have become things for a lot of the stories. We also like to travel and go to as many outdoorsy places as we can. This is actually Kawartha Highlands Park, which is just across the highway from the fire road on which that cabin that you just looked at is situated. This is one end of it, an enormous park. The other end of it is canoe access only. So that's it in the summer. We'll go canoe camping in there. This must be Silent Lake, which is up near Bancroft, which we like to go to in the winter and stay in a yurt. And that is just about the most beautiful and quietest place that I can imagine in the winter. It's fantastic. The skiing's good too. This is over near, this is McGregor Point over near Huron, which is also a beautiful spot. That's Arrowhead. This is just a sort of a small sampling of the kind of stuff that we like to do. We joked at one point that we had sort of given our children short shrift when it came to life experiences because all they'd ever seen was campgrounds and trails and not big cities and stuff. And then we took them to New York City and they were terrified. Now we're up on Lake Superior. So this is the American side, actually looking to the northwest. It's Pictured Rocks National Seashore, which is gorgeous, but Lake Superior is a point of fascination for me and for my wife as well, actually. And those are the aforementioned Pictured Rocks. I think that's the Catskills in New York. Yes, and that's Letchworth State Park in New York State, Western New York. And now we're in Newfoundland, which is still, when we go on these long trips with the kids, we like to discourage screens as possible. It's not always possible, or it's not possible 100% of the time. But in order to do that, we'll do things like audiobooks. We'll take audiobook, big CDs, or we'll download them on the phone, and we'll do big long series. We've done Harry Potter that way and stuff. And so the kids, as we're driving off to these, far-flung places, are exposed to stories. And the summer that we went to Newfoundland, we were listening to The Lord of the Rings. And I think that my kids now equate Newfoundland with Middle Earth. And so it's achieved this sort of mythic resonance for them. And they still speak in very, very reverent tones about Newfoundland and the landscape and the surroundings. And you can see why. I mean, it's a fantastically beautiful place. But this is very close to where we stayed. It's gorgeous up near Trinity Bay. The Skirwink Trail. There's 2 humpbacks frolicking just off the shore. Pretty astonishing places. And this is the moonrise over Dildo Run Provincial Park. Pause for laughter. But I also, so this is, a lot of you may know, maybe you don't, that in addition to fiction, I also write about baseball quite a bit. And I think that there I'm after the same thing that I'm pursuing when I write about nature. It's the same thing that has long fueled a lot of baseball fanaticism, and that's the longing for the pastoral, for green space, both literal and metaphorical, amid the built world. What are these stadiums anyway but anomalous green meadows laid down smack in the middle of the busiest, smoggiest, most calamitous cities? Corporatized versions of the farmers' fields of memory. I mean, this is in the middle of the Bronx, and there's nothing pastoral about the Bronx, but there's an enormous green playing field there. Same with Baltimore. But that brings the second point I'd like to make about how nature influences my writing, and this is a bit of a left turn. I think that my writing, especially and probably increasingly my fiction writing, is an effort to describe the space between nature and humans, the relationship and the interaction, with an understanding that we can move toward nature, but we can't ever or can no longer really get there. John Berger, in his brilliant essay, Why Look at Animals, from this book, about looking, from about 1980, writes, the 19th century in Europe and North America saw the beginning of a process, today being completed by 20th century corporate capitalism, by which every tradition which has previously mediated between man and nature was broken. Berger wrote that 40 years ago, and today you might further say that where our lives used to be governed by the seasons' rhythms, they are now totally governed by algorithms. Literary critic Terry Eagleton says, capitalism plunders the sensuality of the body. I think that you can extend that to state that the system in which we toil seeks to distance us from nature, from the sensuality of the natural world, while purporting to remove us from the struggle and discomfort of it. The modern advertising industry runs on a simple gambit, and it invents a problem and then promotes a product to solve that made-up problem. We all know this, and we're complicit to one degree or another as a matter of convenience. We're daily offered luxuries and devices that sever our ties to the natural world, and then pitch the very things that nature provides, but in artificial versions, echoes, discreetly packaged, pale imitations which are in truth nothing like the real thing. They may look and even feel similar, but they lack the thisness and the interconnectedness of nature itself. That is the distance, I think, that I try to write about, between the simulation and the real thing, between us and the world that sustains us, but which we have carpeted with devised systems so complete in their rapaciousness that we are now on borrowed time, ecologically speaking. There are twice as many people on this planet today as when my mother was born, which blows me away. But each of us now takes more than ever before, not less. We have not scaled our consumption to the specter of depletion. We have instead trebled it. To describe nature is to sketch the unattainable then, and that meets the definition of longing, which is a pretty apt description, I think, of what I do. Longing for place, longing for a time past, a lovelorn nostalgia sometimes. You can see also where baseball might fit into that. So what then, in the face of all this, is writing? What is this art? John Berger again, he says, art mediates between what is given and what is desired. Art is an interface, the space between the thing and us, or our understanding of it. Written language is itself a technology, a human advancement. And the paradox, the sweet pain of it, is that language allows us to explore and express our estrangement, but ultimately proves insufficient to the weighty task of conveying the beauty and the astonishment which nature possesses and inspires in us. Language is the record of our awareness of the distance that we've traveled from our origins, and from that which sustains us. But it's not pointless. In the expression, we feel close to ourselves. We feel alive. It makes us feel alive. And that, I think, is nature's gift to us, if in fact it can be said to consider us at all. Because it is worth noting that while our existence depends on nature, the reverse is not true. Jan Zwicky, in an essay called A Ship from Delos, from the book that you're looking at there, a slim little volume that she co-wrote with Robert Bringhurst. It's called Learning to Die, you can see it there. Zwicky says, to wallow in despair that the natural world is dying is to fail to be aware that it is still in many ways very much alive. It is also to fail to understand that in precipitating drastic climate change and a sixth mass extinction, industrialized humans are not destroying everything. Being will be here. Beauty will be here. Nature is everywhere. It is resilient. It finds a way. It is insistent when it comes to reminding us of its presence. The reality is that we are nature, but we have so much invested in denying that, in believing that we are above it, in exercising our imagined dominion over it, that true communion might never be possible again. Even so, a relationship with nature must nevertheless be our goal. Nature is a perfection. It's an ideal toward which we may strive. Its fringe benefits are still achievable, even if we fall short. And the same goes, I believe, for writing about nature. I can't use words to conjure a tree into being, but I would nevertheless hope that some of my work might participate in the disorganized campaign to convince us that we are yet a part of the natural world. Among those writers better than I whose work attempts this are C.E. Morgan, who in her novel about horse racing and equine breeding, Sport of Kings, equates nature with moral beauty, and in our efforts to shape and alter and bend it to our purposes, locates a devastating failure. Oh, I'm not there yet. Annie Proulx's Bark Skins shows what damage is done to both sides of the equation when humans harvest natural resources without thought of consequence. Richard Powers' brilliant novel, The Overstory, puts human narrative into an ecological timescale. The breathtaking stories of Rick Bass examine both landscape and the effect landscapes have upon the people scattered over them. And Wab Rice, who I hope you had a chance to see this morning, I didn't, unfortunately. I was upstairs homeschooling my kids. He writes about characters recognizing the need to stay close to the land when calamity brings down our societal structures. There are many, many others, of course, and I hope that you have a chance to read all of them. I hope I read all of them, but that we'll have to do as a pretty good sampling. I'll just mention one more. The American essayist Elena Passarello, in her book, Animals Strike Curious Poses, bonus points for anyone who could identify the source of that title. She writes about animals in relation to human beings. She focuses each of the 17 essays in that book on an animal given a name by humans, which is to say, animals that have done something noteworthy or strange enough to be noticed by us. In Celia, an essay named for the last remaining bucardo, which is I had never heard of, but they were a species of giant mountain ibex native to the Spanish Pyrenees. Passarello writes, the last pair of great auks had hidden themselves on a huge rock in the northern Atlantic. In 1844, a trio of Icelandic bounty hunters found them in a crag incubating an egg. Two of the hunters strangled the adults to get to the egg, and the third accidentally crushed its shell under his boot. Later, she writes, Turgi, the last Polynesian tree snail, died at a London zoo in 1996. According to the Los Angeles Times, it moved at a rate of less than 2 feet a year, so it took a while for curators to be sure it had stopped moving forever. The same year, Passarello writes, two administrators of a Georgia convalescent center wrote the editor of the journal Nature, soliciting a name for an organism that marks the last of its kind. Among the suggestions were terminarch, ender, yatim, and last line. But the new word that stuck was endling. Of all the proposed names, Passarello writes, it is the most diminutive, like duckling or fingerling, and perhaps the most storied, like end times. The little sound of it jingles like a newborn rattle, which makes it doubly sad. Later in that same essay, she documents researchers' efforts to preserve the DNA of extinct species and thereby to revive them in the lab. Passarello writes of the coining of a new term, a term which is of interest to artists whose work seeks to connect to nature and to describe some small part of its majesty, to bridge the divide between humans and the natural world. It's a term I'm also seeing pop up a lot in the news these days as wildlife returns to our streets while we're all locked inside. And the word is rewilding. I'm going to do a reading now from Lands and Forests. This story is, first, every time I talk about this book, I just like to show the cover, because the in-house designer at Invisible Publishing, Megan Fields, is amazing. And she's done the cover of all my books, and each one is the last. And I think she can't get better, and she does. And just as objects, I love these things. So Megan, great work. So I'm going to read from a story called Pharaohs, which I chose because I don't think I've ever read this one in public. I guess this is public, even though you're all in my home. But also because it is drawn most directly from those landscapes around our cabin that I showed you. This is, in my mind, this takes place at that cabin and on the lake, just out in front of it. So this is called Pharaohs. Anna Ray Cavers squinted against the glare, fitted the toe of her right boot into the ski's binding, pressed down and felt it click home. Then she did the same with her left. The snow was only a few inches deep atop the lake. It had been a strange winter. She pushed out onto the ice, poling ahead, then gliding her feet after. The skiing was good across the surface, despite the strong wind whistling into her small bay. Strong wind whistling into her small bay. I had to be sure I hadn't written that wrong. Through the pinched mouth that was bracketed by low pine-topped rocks. She felt the cold carve right through her many layers of clothing. It was the coldest day of the winter to date. At midday, it was still the temperature at which materials give up their characteristics and become hard or brittle, cracking along heretofore invisible faults. Her red skis created twin clefts in the perfect clean snow. She leaned forward, her shoulders twinging on the odd pole stroke. It took tremendous effort, but every so often the glide was right, and she moved as though a hand took her by the scruff of the neck and pulled her along, releasing her from all struggle and obligation. Her face was pale and bloodless in that ungodly cold, her eyes like faint blue marbles in saucers of milk. Ice clung to her upper lip and coated her eyelashes, though she began to feel as she skied on a dampness in her gray hair and down her strong back from the exertion required to keep moving. Ski trails crisscrossed the ice, but she seldom saw other skiers. Their tracks were like evidence of another civilization. Sometimes they lingered for days. Other times a mean wind erased them nearly as quickly as they were put down. The tracks were cut every so often by the patterns left by snowmobiles, their twin front skis and rear central tracks. She saw the snowmobiles sometimes too, great bands of them on weekends, ripping across the ice, making their throaty and whiny noise, kicking up clouds of snow. There were none today. It was a Tuesday. Her twin sister Sabina was at that moment down in Florida, as she was every November through April. Anna Ray drove down every few years and enjoyed the break, but she didn't see how her enjoyment could do anything but diminish if she were to stay longer. Sabina, whose blonde hair was to a stranger the only thing to distinguish her from Anna Ray, didn't see it that way. She hated winter and suggested every year that Anna Ray stay with her in Sarasota until the snow was gone. But though the cold cracked the skin of her fingers, causing a searing pain when she plunged her hands into hot dishwater, and though the darkness felt at times interminable, Anna Ray knew she'd never give up her winters. They were so harshly beautiful and somehow necessary to her sense of herself. The specific comfort of sitting by the wood stove with a glass of Chilean wine and a new book to read was not, she felt, duplicable in Florida. The house where she lived those winters, as well as the humid, buggy summers, was barely a house at all. It was a cabin, a cottage. She and Jack had built it 25 years ago, shared it for only a few before he was gone. It began as a shack, 12 by 12, with a roof and not much more. They'd added to it as they could afford the materials to do so, but even now, in its finished state, it lacked air conditioning, central heating, and running water in the winter. Every November, she shut down the pump, hauled the foot valve from the lake, and poured antifreeze down the drains. For most purposes, she'd be on bottled water until May. But she kept an old white enamel pot on the wood stove and added handfuls of snow to it as it melted down. This she used to wash her dishes. They'd done their best to insulate the house, though it had resisted their efforts. Frost furred certain spots on the floor around doors, beneath the kitchen counter. The stove burned all winter, and she had a half-dozen little radiant parabolic heaters spaced throughout the place, including one on either side of the bed. There were a couple she had to be careful not to run at the same time or she'd blow a fuse, so she went from room to room turning them on and off as she moved through her day. There was another heater in the outhouse, strung off a 50-foot extension cord. She used to let it run all the time until she got sick of what it did to her electric bills. After that, she adopted the habit of plugging in the end of the cord, letting it heat up the small plywood box of an outhouse a few minutes before she would head out and down the little path. It didn't stop the cold from reaching up the hole, of course, but it was bearable. Anything is if you're used to it. She put up with all this because she valued nothing so highly as the silence the place afforded her. Her nearest neighbors, resident only on summer weekends, were on the far side of the bay, 200 yards across the water and obscured by jack pines growing on a pair of tiny islands. The fire route on which she lived snaked by on the landward side behind a hunk of Canadian Shield granite that more or less blocked the sound of the few vehicles which used the road. Most of what she heard all day was noise of her own making, or the birds in the oaks and pines surrounding the house, or the small ticking of the stove. She sometimes listened to the CBC on the transistor for news and weather. Anna Ray considered herself lucky to have made a life which so suited her desire to be alone. She missed Jack, of course, but knew that what she actually missed was a time in her life when they'd shared the project of life building, and more things had seemed possible. The ice, 10 inches thick at least, she'd checked yesterday with the auger, settled invisibly, moving against itself, popping and groaning as it did so. It sounded at times like a penny dropped on a drumhead, other times like a plucked bass string, the dying reverberations of which could be felt in the feet. She was out on the open lake now, and its flatness spread out from her in every direction. He had hit her once. The children were still young. Afterwards, nothing was outwardly different. Inside, everything had changed. In the unobstructed wind, there were patches of ice scoured clean of snow, windows down into the black water beneath, reminders that this was not simply flat ground. She passed the spot where she liked to swim in the summer, a small island of little more than rock and a few trees, with a stone ledge off which she could dive into the water that was 40 feet deep. She'd last swum there in September, and it would likely be June before she could do it again. So I will stop there and open it up if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to make.
I'm going to take your screen back.
Yes.
I think.
I can stop it at my end too.
Oh, right. Okay.
There we go.
There we are.
Okay.
That was great. I encourage everyone to read further because she's quite a character. Gosh, you know, you're such a, you know, with to describe your writing like a painting, like there's one stroke of paint, and yet there's so much beneath that glob of whether it's acrylic or oil, and it's like there's this one stroke and it's like, you know, he hit her once, and then you go on and you come back to Jack and this and that and the other, and all your stories are like that. It's just this, the clue or the smallest succinct description of what's happening. Is that so? I'm going to start off questions, obviously, because I'm talking. But please, I encourage others to either write in the chat a question or raise your hand digitally. But in terms of your writing, did you your study? What's your background to write in that succinct kind of real? And it's been described as Monroe-esque.
Someone has described it that way, yeah, which is a very kind thing to say. My study, my work comes from having spent, 2 going on 3 decades of reading short stories very carefully and taking from them the lesson that in a short story, nothing is wasted. There's nothing extra, that everything should be very clean and flowing in the same direction. And it also comes, frankly, from working with a fantastic editor who sees things the same way, a guy named Brian Nabias, who when the writing gets baggy or wanders off course a little bit, he's very good to keep me on course. So a line like that, the one that you mentioned about Jack, comes from knowing what the whole story is going to be and only placing things where I think they're going to have the most impact, which is, in that case, is a sentence that comes out of the blue, like the act would have.
Right. I have a question that I'll read out for Bill, on behalf of Bill. Lands and Forests, the title, and the story of the Forest Ranger, civil servant Frank McDougall, How did that impact come about? He then says, it is a little different than the other stories within the book entitled the same.
Mhm. That story and the truth that inspired it, the story of Frank McDougall, became the organizing principle of the book. The story there is that we were driving through Algonquin Park along the highway, which is through the park. The southern corridor is called the Frank McDougall Parkway. And I was driving, and I think we were on our way home, and the kids were in the back, and the stuff was piled on top of the van. And I said to Christy, "Who's Frank McDougall?" Because I wasn't familiar with the name. My wife is a very long time employee of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests in Ontario, which used to be called the Department of Lands and Forests. But she wasn't familiar with the name either, even though Frank McDougall is something of a legendary figure in the service. Anyway, she read me, the sort of the Wikipedia entry version of his life, and by the time she'd finished reading that to me, I realized that there was at the very least, a story there. And when I went back to some of the stories that I'd written since the publication of my first collection of short stories, I recognized that there were elements in common, which was this sort of fascination with landscape and people placed in relief against landscapes. So that was actually the last story written for the book. Everything else was kind of in the bag, and we had done the majority of the editing on it. And then but I understood that the book needed that story to bookend it.
Mm.
And some people have described the way that we've ordered the stories as there being sort of a biblical progression, from flooding in the first story to fire in the last story. But everyone involved in the production of the book understood that story, though it wasn't yet complete, was going to be a big part of the book. So I took the time, having gotten everything else just about done, to go and do the research and to go up to Sault Ste. Marie and to see his plane and to do all this stuff. And so, whereas it is one of only a couple of stories in the book that required historical research, and it does stand out in that sense, we all felt that the way that nature and humans within nature was depicted in that story placed it next to all the other stories that were already in the book.
Great. Laura has a question. I'm going to unmute Laura.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
Hi, Laura.
Yeah, hi. So my question is a little bit, maybe we're all thinking about things like this now, but with lots more time in our lives to reflect than perhaps we're normally used to. And this being the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, I'm just wondering if you have any reflections that you'd like to share on things how you might reflect differently this Earth Day that maybe leads into future writing, or just a reflection.
Good question. I think that things that I've taken for granted, like the ability to hop in the car and go somewhere and go for a hike, I will not take for granted as much anymore. It's a strange time, and it's interesting to look at things right now through my kids' eyes, because they are fine. They are incredibly resilient and adaptable, and I think we'd all do well to emulate that. I'm the one freaking out a little bit about the way things are going. And all the concerns that my wife and I have are practical ones. The trips that we've canceled and all the things. The kids wake up and it's another day, and they're ready for it. And their ability to make our backyard into the whole world, which is what it needs to be right now, is inspiring to me. We have a cedar hedge, and we have an apple tree that they climb, and we have a patch of grass, and we have a new composter that the kids and I just built, and that's it. But they have turned that into somewhere to spend all their outdoor time, even though they're used to being pretty free-range kids. And it's something I hope that I'll take out of all this.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for asking.
I have two things. We're almost 10 after, so we have about 12 minutes left in the session. So one thing, Andrew, is I wrote down, I'm not sure what story it was from. I have Kara afterwards, but the weathering grief. And the weathering grief to me is such a, there's so much to that phrase. And I almost feel like that is one of your threads as well through your stories, because there's so many people who have either died or do die, and that grief that we within a pandemic feel because we are grieving our life that used to be. And so, you know, whether the phrase is used to how do we weather this grief, or what you meant by it, because it is a really visceral phrase for me.
Mm-hmm. I think that I think I used it to make, you know, to draw the implication that just as, you know, a board left out to the elements, or stone left out for millennia, will bear the imprint of the weather that has washed over it, that grief does that to people as well. Mm-hmm. More broadly, I think that grief inspires or informs the stories. I think that I kind of, you know, it's an impulse I fight in my daily life, but I think I walk through a lot of life feeling a sort of like a sense of pre-grief for things. I don't know if it's a Presbyterian upbringing or I'm not sure what it is, or loving winter. I don't know, but something about it means that I go through anticipating losses. I go through life anticipating loss. So even something that I love and enjoy, I start to look at right away as, oh, this is going to end. You know, which makes it sweeter and sadder at the same time, and somehow I don't know, it lends it a poignancy. You know, I'm constantly being overwhelmed by things emotionally because I look at things that way. And I'm lucky that I have enough people in my life who kind of tether me to the earth and say, you can't go through life like that. But when I'm allowed to go off on those fancies, that's often what inspires stories or passages of writing. I mean, I write about baseball a lot too, right? And that's all about longing for childhood and all that stuff.
Yeah. I love that you brought up rewild. And so as a sort of, before I put a button on all this, I was curious what you think of that. Okay, our cities are being rewild. The kids are resilient. Mm-hmm. Do you think that adults will get rewild? Will we find so. That?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question. I hope so. I hope, you know, I keep getting up every morning during this and hoping that what comes out of this, or that we use this as an opportunity to take the good things out of this, right? The sense of togetherness and the resourcefulness and you know, that we all continue to bake bread and culture our own sourdough and it seems like an opportunity. And historically, I studied history. That was my major in university, and that gave me perspective that historically, when traumatic events, sort of societal or globally traumatic events occur, there is an opportunity for reinvention, right? There is a chance to say, this is the stuff that we can leave behind. This is what we can move forward with. Now, there are so many competing interests and people who don't want the good things to come forward, you know, that it's going to be difficult, but we have an opportunity, and I hope that we take it, to use this as the inspiration for reinvention. You know, if we can get to a point, for example, where global oil prices are negative, you know, negative $50 per barrel, I think that suggests to us that we can move on without oil, you know?
Yeah.
I think that we are now given this opportunity to reimagine things, and we would be foolish not to take it. So I hope that that's what comes of it.
Well, thank you for having inspiring us to a rewild kind of session, as I'm feeling it has been. A couple of things. One is our next session is at 6:30 with the multi-talented author, musician, and poet, Gary Barwin, because this is National Poetry Month. And pre-registration is required, as it is a different Zoom ID from this meeting. I hope that now, after our time with Andrew, that you find a safe outdoor sit spot and reflect on your words, Andrew's, and possibly what you know, where we've been with this past month plus, where we want to go, and just take that time, and be mindful of what's around us on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day Network. I've also included in the chat as a final thank you for being a part of today, our link to the Canadian Ecology Education Foundation of how to donate. I think it's been amazing to be able to share our festival beyond the shores of the Mattawa River. And so, but the Canadian Ecology Center is about keeping kids learning outside, and gosh, that's a really important thing. And your children are so lucky to be free range. I grew up free range on a farm, so I know exactly what you're, along with the chickens, of course, me and the chickens. So anyway, I wish everyone the best. Peace be with you. And I